Now, Africa Day not only looks at the strides made by the continent in the fight against colonialism and apartheid, it's also a time for media professionals like us to look at the work we do. In some countries, we see journalists being jailed or intimidated for doing their work, while in some countries, the challenges appear to be even deeper. Let's look at the role of journalism in Africa now with freelance journalist covering African politics, Carien Plessis, Sophie Mokoena, SABC News International Editor, Thembisa Fakude, Africa-Asia Dialogues Director, Senior Research Fellow. Thank you so much to you all for your time this evening. I'll begin with you, Sophie. Newsrooms are now operating under the COVID-19 financial restrictions. We've seen this, happening over the last 2 years. And this has led to smaller newsrooms, some lower revenues in other areas, as well as circulation and even the closure of some publications. Would you say journalism is under siege?
Journalism is not under siege, but journalism is experiencing challenges. Yes, indeed. Due to COVID-19, many media houses had to scale down their operations. But around the world generally, you have a similar problem. It is not a problem for Africa only, but worldwide. And we have seen people taking decisions to do freelance work like Carien there. And we are continuing to inform the citizens of the continent and the citizens of the globe. But I think we can do better as a continent, particularly big corporates. They can support media on the continent, and we can continue to inform the citizens of this continent, because you know that media can play an important role in strengthening democracy. It can also be a watchdog in terms of issues that are problematic in our.
And Thembisa, listening to also, you also think about the real threat of the survival for the freedom of the press in our continent. What are your reflections tonight?
Well, my reflections are, the dwindling of resources in terms of funding media institutions. We've seen, unfortunately, many media organizations shutting down because of lack of resources. But also there's a need for us to recalibrate the curriculum at the media institutions, the learning institutions, that is, because we still have archaic syllabus that is continually pushed to students, whereas you have the advent of new media, particularly social media, which is currently dominating how we do our business. So we need to look at how we change the way we teach journalism, but at the same time, we also need to look at alternative ways of funding media institutions as they continue to close because of lack of funding.
And Carien, Thembisa talks about social media changing how we do things as journalists. One of the things that has really been clear, even globally, is the impact of fake news on social media and what it has had on journalism. Talk to us about that. When you are looking at what is going on, would you say that in some instances, journalism appears to have taken backseat, overtaken by fake news?
Well, yeah, I think it's difficult to say. A lot of people use social media before they read any news outlets. And I was quite surprised. Somebody told me that her daughter her young daughter was looking for something, and she was Googling YouTube. Like we would Google, she was Googling YouTube. So the child was only watching videos, and that was the way she was perceiving the world, and that was the way she was getting her information. And like Thembisa said, I sometimes feel, I've been working in journalism for 2 decades, and I feel like I know nothing because things have changed so much, and the way people consume news have changed so much. And, we think we're clever, we write these long stories, these long analyses, and then I sometimes wonder, old people like ourselves read it, but do we reach the right audiences? And in that case, I think fake news is a lot more clever sometimes than us journalists. They know how to reach audiences. And I apologize for the background and the connection. I'm sitting here in Accra.
I know you are working. You are working there. We do appreciate your time, Carien. Don't worry. But I'd like to latch on to something you've said and throw the question back to you to say that, has it changed, though, how you do your work now, especially when you look at the fact that we, for example, as journalists and people who love the news would read the long analysis pieces, but some would want the short, sharp reads. Has that changed how you do your job?
It hasn't changed how I personally do my job, although, I think perhaps it should have. And I remember there was a time when we were spending a lot of time sort of disproving the fake news or reporting on fake news and reacting to it. But we've seen developments such as, I think there's Africa Check now. They set out, they check news and they send it out on WhatsApp. There's a specialized branch in journalism in a way to fact check. So, no, it hasn't changed the way, it's made us more careful, I think, definitely, in terms of double checking information, especially if there's information on Twitter, to double check that it's true, because so much is fake. So I guess in a way we're a lot more skeptical now of the information we get, and rightly so. But personally, Twitter and social media, it's changed through the years. We all took up on Twitter and social media. We were told to tweet, and it's good for our careers, good for brand building. But now it's proved to be, this is a whole long other debate, but it's proved to have become a very toxic space. A lot of journalists get attacked on Twitter, and frankly, I'm not sure if it's worth tweeting all our thoughts on Twitter. So in that sense, over the past decade, it's changed, from taking... I sort of changed from taking up Twitter and using it enthusiastically to basically trying not to use it at all. So in that sense, yeah.
Definitely. And I'd like to then move to you also on this one, because the integration of digital when it comes to a newsroom has been very important. But at the same time, as Carien says, the bullying that journalists are then subjected to is of grave concern as well, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I've been a victim on many occasions. It does happen, but as a journalist, you know that what you have communicated is true. And that is why at all times, you have to ensure that you have the correct information, and also you give a right to reply to the aggrieved parties. But at all times, you must ensure that your story is credible, fair and balanced, and therefore whoever accuses you of doing something, your story is credible, and you have ensured that whatever you are communicating, it's just facts and nothing else but facts. But it's quite painful at times, because sometimes it can really get personal, sometimes misinformation. But for me, the critical issue is for people who are on social media to understand, particularly on Twitter, that you have limited words that you can write, and therefore you are not able sometimes to give a background, or perhaps to attribute, you will attribute it, but sometimes you do have a challenge because the characters are very few. Secondly, people don't understand when you write what somebody has said, they tend to say that's your view. And that's not the case. You are there, you are covering the story, you are communicating what the newsmakers are saying. But yeah, it can get hectic, very hectic. But you have to be strong and to be brave and soldier on.
And Thembisa, one of the things that we also saw with digital media has been the paywall. Some saying that they shouldn't be paying for content online, it should be free. And others saying that, but you should pay for quality journalism. I wonder if it was, in fact, a good move to introduce paywalls, because others argue that journalists as well must eat.
No, that's very true. And you see a large exodus of good journalists going to private sector, some going to government, because of, again, the lack of the ability for them to continue surviving given the competitive space that all of us operate within. So those are the challenges that we're all facing. But again, we need to find creative ways of surviving as older journalists, because it's extremely competitive. And if you are going to insist on old ways of operating, unfortunately, we are going to exhaust ourselves, and most good journalists will end up leaving the profession and going to private sector and some to government, as it's been the case. But one point that I'd like to mention regarding the fake media, we also need to be careful of the weaponization of the fake media. I know in most instances, yes, we've had genuine fake visuals, genuine fake messaging, but the dictators, particularly the undemocratic governments in Africa, they've actually weaponized that. Case in point, including some of the Western powers, people like Trump and others, where good journalists continue telling good stories, but they will be accused of fake news. So as journalists, we also need to be very careful of this blanket condemnation of fake news, because there has been a weaponization, particularly by these despots around the world, of fake news.
And when we then look at what you've just said, but at the same time couple it with news fatigue, Carien, one of the things is that we are also seeing the consumption of news has also changed, and some are saying that people don't know how to process what we are putting out. They have fatigue, they're looking at COVID-19, their information are overloaded. How do we begin to address this challenge? Because it's also posing a threat to the work that we do. Carien, I think you are on mute.
I'm sorry, I muted because there's a whole lot of noises around
now
me.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I think sometimes as journalists, if you report on things that people are interested in, if you give them information they can use, information that's relevant to them, I don't think you can. You can overload them with information, and I sometimes think as journalists we need to be sure that we keep in touch with what it is that people want, what it is that is important to them. I'm here at the African Development Bank meetings, and always when I come to these things, it's very clear there's an elite, and we stay. I'm sitting here in the best hotel in town, trying to get the best reception in town. But we tend to lose touch. The elites come and they come in these hotels, they drive around in these cars, and then you walk out in the street and the people here in Ghana and Accra complain about the inflation. I think they had inflation of something like 23 or 26%, that their food prices have gone up. The Uber drivers complain about their fuel prices, like all of us. And here the elites are sitting and they're talking about finance, and they're all eating food, and they don't worry about their fuel or their hotel consumption, their hotel expenses. So I do think, and as journalists, we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of the message that we're communicating from these people, what these people, the elites sit and they do, and what people on the ground feel. And we must make sure to bridge that gap, and not to sort of become part of the elites and report things that people do not find relevant, and report things that people say, well, you report about the grants, you report about all the money that's coming for farming. Where is it? Where do I see it in my life? So I think, if you report relevant news, it can't ever, I don't think people will become tired or saturated.
And certainly a very important point that you raise at the back of what Sophie spoke about, when she says we need to speak to everyone and really be in touch and understand what the people are saying. But also, Sophie, when we look at, the targeting of journalists online, there's also the real threat, though, in some parts of the world where you find yourself as a journalist being arrested for doing your job.
It is true, particularly on the continent. To get accreditation to work on the continent, it's so difficult. There are lots and lots of requirements, and you can see that the intention is to ensure that you are not going to that country to write stories, because the country perhaps doesn't want to open up for journalists to see what's happening in those respective countries. It is very, very difficult. You find a situation when, you listen what Carien has spoken about in terms of where the elites are and the leaders are in terms of ordinary people. For a journalist to travel on the continent, it's no child's play. It's so difficult to enter a country when you are a journalist. When you have entered, you will be followed you'll be monitored. You know, so it is not easy. It is not easy. Sometimes some leaders see journalists as enemies. They don't see us as people who are doing what we are supposed to do, creating space and platform for ordinary citizens on the continent to tell their stories.
And I suppose then, Thembisa, that adds to the layer of weaponization that you spoke about, because it's not only from the position of, declaring, and I'm using that in inverted commas, by leaders to say that this is, a fake news publication, but at the same time, the targeting of journalists when they enter into different countries to do their work is also another layer of weaponization.
No, that's very true. And I think what Sophie is saying is so important. The accreditation process is meant for a number of things. First is to deter good journalists from entering countries, but importantly, it's also to intimidate journalists. And you have politicians who are, by and large, very careless and loose in their tongues when it comes to the media. I mean, it has become commonplace for politicians around the world, including South Africa, to always blame the media. But it's also comforting to see that you have the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, acknowledging the media and sometimes recently thanking the media for their work. But it's not commonplace in many African countries. In many African countries, you have these stumbling blocks like the accreditation, and all of this is meant to not only intimidate the media, because once you're in there and they strip you of your accreditation, it's next plane home. So you have to try and behave because of that accreditation. But importantly is to prevent the unlikables from entering the country to cover news. And
Carien, there's another issue which is around the mental wellness of journalists, especially now that journalists have been at the forefront of covering some horrific stories. And it's really something that is sometimes not really put as a priority in newsrooms, is it not? Carien, I think you're still on mute.
I'm sorry. I'm concentrating so much on what I'm going to say. Yeah, I think all three of us sitting here are from a generation of journalists where mental health was never really an issue, in the sense of it was never really addressed in the newsroom. You kind of just had to, get on with it and get your job done at all costs. And there was never really that dialogue. So I do think it's nice. It's really good now with a younger generation of journalists who are a lot more concerned about that. But I mean, lately the COVID issues, the war in Ethiopia, for instance, and then on top of it, the war in the Ukraine that broke out now a year and a half later. And I think the amount of conflict that we've seen after COVID, people have really lost it, not just journalists. I think in general, the world is going through a really tough period. And I think we're still going to see more tough times with the rise in the inflation, the rise in food prices, the rise in fuel prices. And yeah, I mean, journalists, you need to look after yourself. Because not only, I mean, you can't switch off. Some of my friends say, well, the news is too bad, I'm switching off for the day or for the week. You can't do that as a journalist. You have to, I mean, we have to process it all the time, and we have to report on it. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's actually, it's nice to be able, I mean, I'm lucky to be able to travel out of South Africa and to kind of get a perspective from outside, to go to countries where the problems are, I mean, I think there's a lot of problems everywhere, but it's nice to be somewhere where the problems aren't mine. But I think, journalists in general need to be aware. And we're also not the kind of people who stop easily. We like to keep on working. We're obsessive about our jobs. And I think it is nice of the younger generation of journalists. I've certainly learned a lot from them, saying, but if you're not okay, do something. Whether it be exercise, whether it be going to see a doctor or a psychologist, or just to talk to a colleague. So yeah, and it's something we should be, really aware of, especially now in these times.
I'll turn this question to you, Sophie, because you're an editor, you deal with journalists. They are not exempt from dealing with some of the challenges that we're facing in the country and globally. How then do you begin to address this issue of their mental wellness?
You know, it is a difficult job, but fortunately, I was able to adapt. For example, when COVID-19 started in China, it was December, we were on holiday. January, I had to come back early and cut my leave short to do the story. From that time, I've never had time to really pause and reflect because it was covering this traumatic story, but also team members, some of them getting affected and or their families getting affected, including myself, my family getting affected. Therefore, it was so difficult. It is still very difficult. Just COVID-19. This was a pandemic. No one was prepared for this kind of a story. This story that touches everyone. And then this year, the war in Ukraine. I mean, to go through, sift through those visuals when they arrive from your news agencies and journalists, the horrific videos, you get affected. I am still stuck with that story to date. Yesterday, I mean, in the United States of America, 21 people gunned down. I'm a human being. I mean, you thinking as a mother, as a grandmother, you know, you put yourself in the situation where these people are, the parents, you know, how difficult it is for them and the emotion. There's no way. I'm traumatized. I don't want to tell lies. COVID-19, Ukraine, and many other stories that I've covered on the continent. Sometimes they stay with me for a long time. And these two in particular, I mean, the last time we knew or there was a pandemic, it was in 1918.
And
We've never experienced something like that.
definitely.
The war, let's talk about the conflicts are there also. Yemen, Middle East, on the continent, there are pockets of conflict. You do these stories. You are a human being. Even in South Africa, when there are tensions, when there are, when it becomes violent, these march and all of that, you get affected. We are human beings. The issue of, the fight between the foreign nationals and South Africans, when it gets heated, you get affected. You even get caught in a crossfire because somebody didn't listen properly what you said, and you are now being labeled as a xenophobic person or a person against South Africans. It's very traumatic.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. But thank you so much for your insights to all of you. Definitely a lot needs to be done in order to ensure that journalists are safe when doing their work. Journalists are given the right tools, but at the same time taken care of mentally. So let me thank you to you all for your time this evening. That was freelance journalist covering African politics, Carien Plessis, Sophie Mokoena, SABC News International Editor, Thembisa Fakude, Africa Asia Dialogues Director, Senior Research Fellow.